So it is my pleasure to introduce Andrei Kartashov, who is a master's student and a graduate teaching assistant and a Fulbright scholar at the Department of Film and Media Studies. He received his bachelor degree in Russian from St. Petersburg State University in his native city of St. Petersburg. And before coming to the US, he worked as a film critic and editor in St. Petersburg-based magazine Seance, right? And his academic interests include film theory and philosophy, digital theory, and surrealism. And I actually don't have the title of your talk here, but maybe I can give the floor to you and you can remind. Yeah, you can introduce your talk.
Thank you, and thank you for Chris for having me. So, the subject of my talk today is a new film, Closeness, that was released this year in Russia and premiered before being released in Russia, premiered in Cannes. And I want to talk about the film and use it as a springboard, kind of, to talk a little bit about the question of regionalism in Russian cinema and whether it is a valid term at all. The whole notion of it. So, Closeness, or Tesnota, as it's called in Russian. Like I said, premiered in Cannes on Certain Regard section and won a prize from FIPRESSI, which is the International Federation of Film Critics. And drew considerable attention from international press, was praised by many critics around the world as one of the most exciting premieres in Cannes, and one of the major discoveries, because the film is the first work, the first feature film. A little bit about the story. So the film is set in Nalchik, in Kabardino-Balkaria, in 1998. So I brought up a map for those of you who are not very familiar with Russian geography. Kabardino-Balkaria is a small republic in the North Caucasus of Russia. As you can see, it borders Georgia. On the Russian map, it looks like this. You see, it's on the very edge of the country, far from Moscow, far from from federal central Russia, as we know it. And this region has a diverse population, and it's got its name from two nations that are indigenous to the place. There are also other ethnic groups who live there. Russians live there, surely, and other groups as well. Religious diversity is also huge. There are Muslims, there are Christians, and there is a small Jewish population, which is in the center of the film's story. Because the single protagonist, is a young woman named Ilana, probably a teenager, maybe in her early 20s, who lives with her Jewish family in Nalchik in the late 1990s. And the story has a criminal story that's going on. Her brother, who has just been engaged, is kidnapped by local mobsters, and the family needs to try to find money for ransom. The police is unhelpful, and they don't even consider going there, and the amount of ransom is too large for them to cover. So they seek help from local Jewish community, but they still can't make it. Then they decide to, well, I won't say much what happens then, but they decide to take more radical measures to get out of this situation and get the young boy back. So the film story is essentially, although it has this genre criminal quality to it, it's essentially a family drama. And the main focus of the film is the familial dynamics within that family. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention is, of course, that the film, after Cannes, it was shown at the Odessa Film Festival that Vitaly talked about a month ago in this room. And then also it has already made its North American premiere in Telluride. And I think it may be, although it's not available yet, but I think it may be coming to, maybe not to theatrical release, especially in Lawrence, Kansas, but probably to streaming services at some point, given how well it's doing on the festival circuit. So back to the story. It is a family drama. We have Ilana, we have David, her brother, we have parents, and the extremely complex relationship of these people who live under the same roof, although the children are already grown up, although young. They all share one very cramped space. And what is important is that their status as alien to that place is extremely important. They're Jewish, and they're not even originally from that place, as becomes apparent when they try to they are asking for money from the local community, and they receive some, but they are also they also understand that they are, as as outsiders, they're not really wanted even among their own people. So they're permanently displaced people. As Jews, they don't have, in Russia, which is an extremely diverse country, they don't have their own territory, unlike most other ethnicities that comprise Russia, the country. Because, as I'm sure many of you know, Russia is a country where ethnic groups have their territories. It's not like in many other countries. We'll talk, even if sometimes it's quite nominal that they have their own land, but it's still, it is assumed on the constitutional, on the legal level that they do. That's something I will return to a bit later. So the title refers to several things. It is quite literally, on the visual level, very close. The director, Kantemir Balagov, uses several different cinematic devices to achieve that effect, and those include very narrow aspect ratio. It's 4:3. It's very narrow. It's almost square. It's something that we are used to seeing in older films before the 60s, I would say, or even the 50s. He uses a lot of close-ups. He uses very cramped composition within a frame. There is a lot of blocking going on. Part of the frame is very often blocked by an object or a person, which is another sign of this lack of space that the characters live in. It's worth saying that the Russian word "tesnota" is it does mean closeness, but it also means lack of space, and it also means closeness in several aspects. It's everything is literally close to each other. It also means a certain kind of intimacy that people have who share a small space. The international title emphasizes this aspect of that, the closeness of it. So to make some idea of what it looks like, we're gonna see the trailer of the film. It's short, it's just 1 minute long. It doesn't have English subtitles, unfortunately. I couldn't find a clip with English subtitles. It's French subtitles, if that's helpful. But it also doesn't have a lot of dialogue, this film. And I just want everyone to see how it looks like more than what they're talking about. This is the soundtrack is a very kitschy song from the 1990s that the film makes use of. It is actually a part of the soundtrack when she goes to a nightclub. We can hear that, or at the party we can hear this song by Tatiana Bulanova. Anyway, so as you can see, this feel that the film conveys is very almost tactile, almost haptic. And this sense of closeness of the title, I would argue, emphasizes the communal aspects of their living in this situation, of their familial situation, and of their community that is kind of isolated, the Jewish community that is isolated and small, surrounded by other ethnicities and religious groups. The aesthetic choices are important here because in international cinema, in the language of international cinema, the opposite of what we see here, vastness, emptiness of spaces, came to signify impossibility of communication and the situation of postmodernity, of post-historical situation, probably. We can see numerous examples in Western and non-Western cinema, like Antonioni would be an example, or films of Tsai Ming-lan, for instance, in Taiwan, or in Russia, a film that I talked about here in the spring semester, Target, by Alexander Zildovich, which also said in the future it makes use of empty spaces and very rarefied composition techniques and white color, as opposed to the vivid colors of closeness, browns, reds, blues, and all others. I would say that what Balagov does in this film, that he challenges this post-historical narrative that was actually formulated by Fukuyama around about the same time in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, as it seemed back then, joined the liberal world of Western countries. In Balagov's film, this opinion is countered because those characters are not post-historical, they are very historically situated. Not only because it's set in the past, but also because the effect of the disintegration of the Soviet Union is different here. We see that the state eliminated itself from the lives of these people. It's not present, and all they have is their own people. Tribe is a word that is often used in this film, be that a family or their ethnic, religious community. So the big brother of the USSR disappeared and gave way to other pre-state, pre-national forms of coexistence. Only family remains. It is interesting to know that the director himself did not know the Soviet Union because he's actually very young. He's only 26 now. He is 5 days older than me. So like myself, he never lived in the Soviet Union. He doesn't remember it. But any retro film, any film about the past, will necessarily make a connection with the present day. So I think what happens here is that Balagov looks at the era from the present in which those structures that defined the experience of the Soviet people have been in a way reinstated in Russia. And so his point of reference is probably the present, but not the past. But even if that is an intuitive choice, it speaks, I would say, a lot about the post-Soviet states. I mean, it is telling, I would say, that it is these aspects of life in the Soviet Union, life in the post-Soviet Russia, that he remembered and emphasized. I interviewed the director a few months ago, and I asked him why did he choose the 1990s for as a setting for his film, and his answer was that he did not really think about the post-Soviet as such, or he didn't tell me that he was thinking about it. But his reasoning was that this kind of story is a something that could happen back then, but cannot happen now necessarily, because even though there is still crime and gangs and all that, but it's changed. It is now, that he didn't say, but I would think that it is now more, crime is now more connected to corrupted systems of power, and that was not even present in the era that the film is talking about. Another important aspect of the film is that tactile experience that I think is perceptible even in the trailer. We see a lot of close-ups, and we can almost touch the screen, which makes like the objects, especially if you are familiar with that time and that space, and that was the case for me. So my experience is probably very close to the filmmakers, because although I did not live in Nalchik, but I lived in Russia at the same time, and many aspects are shared between different parts of the country in that era. So that haptic quality of the film would make it a great case study for a great case for a phenomenological study of film. It is something that Vivian Sobchak wrote a lot about, and all the more interesting in that regard is that the film includes. The film is, of course, a fiction, but it includes real footage, and it's a kind of footage that Sobchak also wrote about as a problematic for a phenomenological scholarship of cinema. At some point, Ilana and her boyfriend and his friends, they watch a videotape, and there are some music videos on it, but then there is a video of slaughtering of Russian soldiers during the Chechen War. And the video is real. Although we don't actually see the killing on screen, it is hard to see, of course. And it is something that was really happening in Russia at that time. Those videos were made by was made during the war, and they were distributed illegally. And according to Sobchak, the act of death seen on screen presents a problem to cinematic representation, because if film is something that you experience and that connects to your experience, and your experience connects to the experience that is presented on screen, then death is beyond representation, because it is transcendental. It's beyond anyone's experience, any living viewer's experience, of course. And what she says about death in a nonfiction film is that it deals with, documentary in general deals with the act of dealing with death, not death itself. So its usage in this film, it achieves double goal. On one hand, it represents representation. It represents the experience of the characters watching it, but it also refers to us themselves who watch it. So we have two experiences that somehow connect to each other. That, of course, brings a lot of ethical questions to the director, and those were made in after Cannes screenings and after screenings in Russia. Some people, from what I've heard, people walked out in Cannes from the screening, and judging from the reviews in the Western press, many people did not actually believe that it was real. They assumed it was staged, but it wasn't. And I would say that the inclusion of this video connects to the same theme, that the characters are presented with this brutal, violent footage, and they are alone in front of it. There is no censoring actor that mediates the horror of the war that is happening nearby. Yes, that, by the way, is something that was not necessarily a part of life in other parts of Russia in the 90s. And that is to say that the film does have some regional specificity to it, but it doesn't have any exoticism. Although the trailer, it features local folk music, and it is included in the film's soundtrack as well, but it actually debunks a lot of stereotypes that exist around people from the North Caucasus in Russia. And that brings me to the reception of this film and other films not made in Moscow or St. Petersburg in Russia. The experience is that is presented in Closeness is, I think, relevant to everyone. It was certainly relevant for me, and judging from the reception at festivals outside of Russia, it was also relevant to people around the world. That being said, at this festival, viewers in Europe and in North America perceive the film as a Russian film, whereas in Russia itself, this film is perceived as a Kabardinian film. And that has something to do with Russia's unique, maybe, status among Western countries, in that it still retains its colonies. Many of its colonies that are now called republics, but essentially the same colonial situation is maintained. And for many people who live, let's say, in St. Petersburg, which is where I'm from, Nalchik is, they know that it's a part of Russia, but it's not really considered a part of Russia. It's almost a foreign country. And that same goes to other places like Chechnya, like Buryatia or Yakutia or Sakha as well. All of those so-called autonomous republics of Russia. And as Russian scholars also, I'm sure, know, there is a lot of confusion that stems from it, such as, for instance, in Russian, nationality actually means ethnicity. And Russian, the word itself, can be translated two different ways. one being ethnic Russian and another being Russian national. And that caused me a lot of difficulty when I was translating the interview with Balagov from Russian to English. And when he says Russians as ethnic Russians, Ruskiye, I had a really hard time translating it to English, so I had to do like ethnic Russians in brackets, because otherwise it's confusing for people who are not aware of the ethnic situation in that country. And that also means that films that are made outside of so-called central Russia are considered regional films, and that's a term that's been used since, I would say, maybe for past 10 years, since the cinema of Sakha, Yakutia, has been gaining attention. There are several industries, film industries, that exist independently from Central Russia. So Yakutia, or Sakha, is this incredibly vast region in Russian northeast, very scarcely populated, that has a robust film industry on its own that serves mostly domestic market, domestic as in Sakha market. And those films are very successful in this republic itself, but they don't travel much outside of it. Although they have some ambition, and some films have been shown in other places, but mostly they work for their own audience. And another place where that happens is Buryatia, which has a smaller but still a significant film industry for territory of this size and population. And there have been other cases, like film Gulls that was made in Kalmykia, which is a different part of the country altogether. It's here. It's not far from the North Caucasus. Kalmykia is predominantly Buddhist republic on the Volga, near the Volga. And all of those phenomena do not have much in common, actually. The Sakha film industry is a commercial industry that produces comedies and horrors and other genre films for a Republican release. And Seagulls, Gulls, I think it was, on the other hand, was the festival film that played in Berlin and a few other festivals. I'm not sure if it made it in theaters at all. And Closeness, Tesnada, is also a festival drama that was actually released in theaters in Russia this July. But my point is that they don't have that much in common, and regional cinema, as far as Russian film goes, is an umbrella term that does not necessarily explain anything about the state of Russian industries. I would say that those, especially the Sakha film industry, should be treated as a separate thing altogether, because they don't have any kind of participation from Moscow studios and St. Petersburg studios or other places in Russia. Closeness is a little bit different in that regard. It was produced by Lanfilm, which is a St. Petersburg-based film studio, the oldest Russian film studio, and it was also produced by Alexander Sakurov's foundation that supports independent filmmaking. That happened because Balagov, the director of Closeness, was a student of Sakurov's. And that is a story that was talked about a lot in Russian film community for the past few years. Sakurov, who is of course a very prominent Russian filmmaker based in St. Petersburg, who made Russian Ark and Faust and other films, including Francophonia that we showed in the spring here at KU. He came to Kabardino-Balkaria in 2010 to teach a course on program on filmmaking, which was a one-time thing that he did. He never repeated that experience, and that was a unique gesture because the North Caucasus never had a film industry, never had a film school, and any form of film education. So that was the opportunity provided by the Kabardino-Balkarian State University for people from that republic and from the bordering republics to study filmmaking and gain those skills and possibly to build eventually an industry in the North Caucasus, which never happened and probably is not going to happen anytime soon because there is no money for filmmaking and there is no professionals, not enough professionals to work on in the crew. But what happened was there was this one class that Sakurov invested a lot of his time in, making sure that they were taught not only practical skills but also history of arts and history of literature and history of cinema as well. And as is evident from Closeness, by doing that, those students mastered an international film vernacular that is considered some kind of a norm of festival filmmaking, but also they developed an understanding of how contemporary cinema works and what is in demand among cinema audiences internationally. That, I would say, is different from what is normally expected from Russian filmmakers, who are from those who are most successful even in outside of Russia. And I'm thinking in particular of Andrei Kartashov, whose new film Loveless was also shown in Cannes, and recently, as in last week or 2 weeks ago, was Russian, not nominated for Oscar, but Russian entry. Russian entry for the Academy Awards. I would say that what Mr. Zvyagintsev does, and why is he kind of a controversial figure in Russia, much more so than he is abroad, is that he presents, he works with expectations from Russianness in film, and he is often seen in Russia as a person who, as a director who tries to define the country in each film as a whole, like making a very grand statement about the country, and that is something that works better for Western audiences who are interested in understanding Russia as a mysterious space, mysterious country that they hear about in the news but don't necessarily know much about. But it receives very polarized reviews and opinions in Russia itself. Balagov, on the other hand, takes a very particular environment, takes a kind of a case study, makes kind of a case study of a certain family, of a certain group in a certain place and in a certain era, and makes a film that is more relevant to, more global in its outreach than many films that are made in the traditional centralized Russian film industry. The moral of the story, I would say, is that the so-called regional cinema is sometimes and oftentimes potentially able to offer something for the world that Russian cinema per se, the Russian film industry cannot. That is pretty much what I wanted to say about this film, and if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer.